Hi, this is Dr. Sacha McBain. I am a clinical psychologist and Associate Director of the Center for Trauma Prevention, Recovery, and Innovation at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences in Little Rock, Arkansas. This is our first video in a series called CPR for PTSD, How to Calm and Prevent Realarm for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorders. CPR for PTSD was originally designed as an in-person educational group for adults that we provide as part of the center. In order to increase access to the information, we decided to create an online series of videos that would be available to those served by our center, but also for our larger community. CPR for PTSD is designed to provide education about trauma-related disorders, and to introduce skills to cope with the experiences of trauma, the symptoms of PTSD, and to increase well-being. These videos are not designed to be therapy, and they're not meant to tell you if you have PTSD or not. If you're watching this and you feel like you're relating to the experiences that I'm discussing, I encourage you to reach out to a mental health professional or a doctor that you trust who can help you get referral to a mental health professional. I'll link additional resources in the description box to help you figure out how to access mental health treatment in your area. We'll be covering lots of different topics in the series, including what trauma is, trauma-related diagnoses, the effects of traumatic stress, but also introduce you to coping strategies and the different types of coping skills. And then finally, we'll be talking about the different types of evidence-based treatments for trauma-related disorders and help you get some guidance about how to make decisions about what treatment might be best for you. I hope that you find this series helpful and informative. We'll be covering lots of different things, so feel free to pause and come back. And on that note, let's get started. First, let's start with describing what a traumatic event is. A traumatic event is something that has happened to you, or that you've seen or you've learned has happened to someone else. It can be life-threatening and include things like abuse, a car accident, community violence, crime, domestic violence, natural disaster, racism, or sexual assault. This is not an extensive list of things that we can consider traumatic, but that's just to give you an idea of how widespread the experiences of trauma can be. After a traumatic event, you may have something called a trauma response. This is how you react to the event. You may have a hard time dealing with what happened. It can be hard to do normal daily activities. Most people have some of these feelings after a traumatic event. And people can have a mild response to a more extreme response right after the event. For those who are experiencing lots of distress soon after the trauma, they may have something called acute stress disorder. Someone might receive this diagnosis when their early responses to the trauma are really interfering with their daily life, their ability to work or go to school, or is getting in the way of their relationships. Most people start to feel better after a few weeks or months after an event. If someone is still having symptoms that make life difficult 1 month after a trauma, or if they get worse or they don't go away, they may have PTSD. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. It is a mental health diagnosis that is given to people who meet symptom criteria after a traumatic event. PTSD is not the same for everyone. Every person has symptoms in a different way. PTSD symptoms can start quite a bit later after the traumatic event, and they can come and go over time. There's 4 different categories of symptoms that we think of when we think of PTSD. The first cluster of symptoms is related to an experience of you keep going over the details of the traumatic event in your head. Memories of the event can come back at any time. You may have the same feelings or horror that you did when the event took place. You could have nightmares, flashbacks. So this is feeling like you're going through the event again, as if you're reliving the event. And also you can experience something called triggers. A trigger is something that you see or hear or smell, touch or taste that causes you to relive the event. The second category of symptoms is all around avoidance. When you have PTSD, you may avoid things, places, or people that remind you of the event. When you avoid uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, it can actually make your symptoms worse. So when you're experiencing symptoms of PTSD, you may not want to talk or think about the event. It might feel dangerous to be in a crowd, and so you want to avoid public places. You want to avoid doing what you were doing during the event. So for example, driving after being in a car accident. And you may avoid seeing things that remind you of what happened, like TV or movies that are similar to your experience. The way you think about yourself and others may change because of the trauma. You may find that you're not having good feelings towards people. You are staying away from relationships. You might forget parts of the event, not be able to talk about the event, think that the world is unsafe or that you can't trust anybody. Sometimes when people experience trauma, it can confirm beliefs that they already had about the world. So before a traumatic event, you thought that people couldn't be trusted, and then someone hurts you, and as a result, it confirms how you were already believing the world to be. The fourth category of symptoms is feeling very nervous. You may feel jittery. You could be startled by loud noises or surprises. You can suddenly become angry or irritable. This is something called hyperarousal. This is always being on the lookout for danger. One thing that I hear often from people who are experiencing PTSD or have experienced trauma is having a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep and having trouble thinking because there's just so many thoughts in your head, or there's really big emotions. It's hard to really focus in the moment. There's also something called complex PTSD. Complex PTSD is a mental health problem that can develop after traumatic events that happen over and over again. Often, complex PTSD happens after long-term physical, emotional, or sexual abuse by someone that you have a relationship with, like a parent, or where someone is under the control of an abuser. Complex PTSD can also develop after being displaced, for example, like refugees, or when your human rights have been violated, meaning your rights have not been respected, or institutional abuse, so systems that have led to trauma for groups of people, so things like discrimination or racism. If you have complex PTSD, you may have some of the same symptoms as you would with PTSD, but you may have additional symptoms that make it hard for you to connect with other people. You may find that it takes a long time to calm down after being upset. You might feel chronically frozen or empty or exhausted. You might feel numb or emotionally shut down. Another symptom of complex PTSD is feeling disconnected from yourself or not really knowing who you are, not knowing your identity. It's hard to really say who you are and what your values are. You might find that you feel like you're a failure or worthless, and you can feel cut off from other people. When we experience abuse or trauma as children, we really aren't able to separate what happens to us from who we are. We make sense of the world through our actions. When I do A, then B happens. For example, when I'm quote unquote bad, then I am hurt. It is my fault. This can lead to feelings of self-blame or guilt or shame. This can often lead to pushing away our emotions and ourselves until we become small to try and feel safe. In the moment, this can help us survive an abusive or dangerous situation. The problem is that as we grow up, or if we get out of a situation, the ways that helped us survive the abuse can sometimes make life more painful or difficult as we no longer need those strategies to survive. We might even add more dangerous coping strategies like self-harm, disordered eating, or substance use to cope with all the feelings we couldn't process as a child or when we're in the context of long-standing abuse. It's also important that we talk about a couple other types of trauma. The first is intergenerational trauma. This is a type of trauma that is transferred between generations. For example, traumatic experiences that your grandparents experienced can be passed to your parents through biology or genetics, but also through behavior. These experiences then impact you through your own biology and genetics and how your parents interacted with you as a child. Signs of intergenerational trauma include things like unresolved emotions and thoughts about a trauma, negative repeated patterns like beliefs about parenting, multiple family members experiencing substance use or mental health problems, or difficulty in relationships or lots of conflict in the family across generations, like parent and child or grandparents or even further back relatives. And another thing that we often can see with intergenerational trauma is when a family is hiding abuse or not talking about trauma that happened within the family. And so even though people aren't talking out loud about what happened, it's almost like it's just in the air. It's part of the experience around being with the family, that there just feels like there's a lot of emotion or different experiences that aren't being talked about but are existing within the family. Historical trauma is a type of intergenerational trauma in which a group share trauma that is experienced over someone's life and across generations. The trauma impacts all or most members of the cultural group. Trauma responses from one generation are passed down to children and grandchildren and other generations. Examples of historical trauma include things like genocide, slavery, loss of land or economy, oppression and racism, loss of language, or banned religion. Signs of historical trauma include things like fear of judgment or stereotypes, feeling like you can't be yourself, loss of identity or self-esteem. That can either be loss of your own identity or self-esteem, or the self-esteem of your group that you identify with. And another one is having to constantly think about threats because of who you are or how you look. People who have experienced intergenerational or historical trauma do not always have PTSD or complex PTSD. To have a trauma response to these kinds of traumas does not mean that you have a disorder. You may be responding to ongoing traumatic experiences. Even if you do not have a disorder, coping skills, therapy, and things like advocacy or activism can help heal intergenerational or historical trauma. So we've reviewed the different types of traumas that people can experience, including single events like a car accident, long-standing things like abuse, or intergenerational trauma where traumas are passed through the family, and historical trauma where multiple people within a group experience the same traumatic stressor. We've also talked about different trauma-related disorders, including acute stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. These types of traumas don't happen on their own. They happen within a system, whether it's within relationship to another person or in a community or within our world. And so there are parts of trauma, whether it's an oppressive system or a family that we're in, that we might not be able to change right away or to change at all. But there are parts of experience after a trauma that are within your control. And how you think about yourself and how you navigate through the world, there's some parts of that you can control. And so the rest of the information that we're going to be talking about throughout this series is really focused on tools that you can start to use today to heal parts of trauma that you've experienced, or to help you manage symptoms of PTSD, or to help you get a better sense of how to move towards healing and well-being. So we're not going to be talking explicitly about how systems and societies and organizations really help paint the picture of trauma, and those are really important too. But for the purposes of these videos, we're going to be talking about the skills that we can use as individuals or in relationship to people that we trust to help us feel better in the moment to moment, the day to day. Let's talk about how trauma is related to the body. During a traumatic event, it's likely that you experience something called a fight or flight response. The fight or flight response is your body's automatic reaction to a threat. What this looks like is your body getting ready to either fight what's threatening you or to run away from it. So you will physically notice that your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, you might sweat, your muscles might get tense, and this is all of your body's way to get you ready to run away or to fight the threat. There's also something called the freeze response, and this can also happen during a traumatic event. What the freeze response is designed to do is to protect you from physical or emotional pain. So it can almost look like you don't really feel connected to your body. You might almost even feel paralyzed. It can be hard to think, and it's just kind of like coming in on yourself until the traumatic event ends. All three of these responses are normal and automatic during a traumatic event. You don't get to choose if you have these responses or not. This is how your body reacts. What can happen is that after a trauma, when you're stressed or anxious or upset or triggered to be reminded of the traumatic event, you can experience those same reactions again, even when you're not directly threatened. Over time, this can really wear on your body and can cause health problems. For example, you might develop high blood pressure or stomach problems. Trauma memories can also be stored in the body. You may feel physical sensations you felt during the trauma. Oftentimes, people who have experienced trauma also have physical health problems for these reasons. This is something that we call the mind-body connection. This means that your body responds to the way that you think, feel, and act. So when you're stressed or anxious or upset, your body reacts in a way that might tell you that something isn't right. Because our body has such a strong response when we've experienced trauma and when we're triggered to have trauma-related memories, it's important to focus both on the health of our mind and our body in order to heal from trauma. This is especially true for people who are experiencing what we call chronic stressors or chronic stress. So if you're somebody who has experienced trauma, whether it's one trauma or multiple traumas or historical or intergenerational trauma, that is really hard on the body. And there's likely still things in life that might trigger those same responses, whether it's the home environment that you're in, discrimination, the safety of your environment, relationships at work or at home, whatever it might be. It keeps your body in that constant state of stress. And what we know is that that can wear down the body. And one way to heal is to focus on calming down the body. The purpose of bringing more physical calm to your body is so that when you do come in contact with real threat, your body can respond as it needs to. Oftentimes after a trauma, it's almost like if you think about an alarm system. The fight or fight response that you experience during a traumatic event can get quickly paired with things in the environment that didn't really have meaning before. Then later, when you encounter those things, you are likely to have another fight or flight reaction. So your nervous system senses that cue, which could be a sight or a sound or smell or even a time, and then your body reacts as if you're in danger again. These reactions will fade over time if you don't avoid those cues. However, if you keep avoiding them, your body doesn't learn what's safe and what's not, what is a true cue of danger and what isn't. So it doesn't really actually tell you if you're actually in danger when all of these false alarms are constantly going off. And so part of what we need to do when we're healing from trauma is to kind of get our alarm system back in check to be able to know how to respond to true danger and how to respond to cues that aren't really actually dangerous rather than avoiding them. One way to help calm your mind and body is to change your breathing. This can help us manage those chronic stressors that are keeping our body really activated. So for example, if you're walking around and your stress level is here day to day, and then something happens and now your stress level is up here, and it can be really hard to deal with and it can be hard to come back down. What breathing can help with and getting used to calming your body is that you can go from having your stress level to here to maybe here. And so when something stressful happens, you react and you're here instead of up here like you were before. So what we're doing is helping to reduce that baseline level of stress so that when something happens, you have a different response than when you were really stressed and activated. Breathing can also help in the moment of a stressor. It can help you stay in your body, to stay focused and deal with the problem in the way that is going to be most effective. Oftentimes we're not used to using deep breathing, and when we're upset or overwhelmed, we tend to breathe into our chest quickly, and this can actually make those symptoms worse. It can stress us out even more. And so the goal is to slow down the breathing and to kind of get it in a rhythm where it's a little bit more slowed down and your body is a little less reactive. By focusing on deep breathing and practicing this skill, it can actually help you reduce feelings of anxiety, irritation, or anger and help you feel calm and more grounded. I'm going to link in the description box below some of my favorite breathing exercises here for free on YouTube that you can check out and practice between now and watching the next video. That's all the information we're going to cover today. We talked about trauma, trauma-related disorders, and started to think about how the mind and the body are connected when it comes to experiences of trauma. In our next video, we're going to be talking about how trauma is related to our emotional experience and talk a little bit more in depth about trauma-related triggers and how to cope with them. I hope you'll tune in for video 2. Until then, bye.